Hi everyone! Tonight we begin with the rise and fall of Pompeii. So turn the lights off and get settled in for a trip back to Roman times. Please give the video a like and subscribe if you enjoy watching. Tell me what you think about the video in the comment section. In southern Italy, where the sunlight had a way of turning everything gold, the city of Pompeii rested in easy comfort. The streets were alive with chatter. The smell of bread floated from stone ovens, and merchants hawked olives by the basket. To the north, Mount Vesuvius rose like a gentle green guardian. To the people here, it was a friend, the reason their grapes grew fat and their soil was rich. They didn't know it was a sleeping giant. Why would they? It hadn't stirred in centuries. Pompeii wasn't some sleepy backwater. With nearly 20,000 people, it was a proper city, the kind with public baths, an amphitheatre, and enough wine shops to make sure nobody stayed thirsty for long. The streets were paved with volcanic stone, laid out in neat grids. Rainwater ran into cleverly designed gutters. The rich lived in grand villas with mosaics on the floor, and the poor still had fountains to drink from. It was the kind of place where you could wake up, stroll to the market, and know you'd bump into someone you knew. The mountain was part of life's backdrop. Farmers blessed it for the fertile soil. Poets wrote about its beauty. Nobody feared it. You could climb its slopes for a picnic, drink wine overlooking the bay, and never once think about lava. If you asked a Pompeian, they might tell you the mountain had once been home to Hercules, or that it was just there, a big green lump on the horizon. Pompeii's location was perfect, close enough to the Bay of Naples to feel the salty breeze, far enough inland to avoid most storms. The harbour bustled with ships from Africa, Greece, and Spain. Exotic goods arrived in crates, perfumes, silk, spices, and strange fruits that locals tried and sometimes pretended to like. If you were lucky enough to live here, the world came to you. Daily life here was a mix of comfort and noise. The rumble of cartwheels over stone, the bark of dogs, children playing knucklebones in the street. Bakers kneaded dough at dawn, tavern owners poured wine before noon, and politicians tried to look busy in the forum. The smell of fresh bread mixed with the scent of the sea, and occasionally the less pleasant aroma from the public latrines. Pompeii's streets weren't just for walking, they were social spaces. People lingered outside shops, chatting as they bargained for figs or almonds. Laundry hung from second-story balconies, flapping like flags of everyday life. Even the stray dogs knew their place, weaving between legs in hopes of dropped bread. And above it all, Mount Vesuvius stayed quiet, its slopes catching the last light of the afternoon like a painting no one thought would ever change. If you were a traveller arriving in Pompeii for the first time, you'd probably be struck by its colours. Walls were painted deep reds, sunny yellows and rich blues. Frescoes decorated taverns and private homes. Even the graffiti had a certain artistry to it. Love notes, political slogans, and occasional insults carved or painted where everyone could see. It was a city that didn't hide its personality. The city's water system was a marvel. Aqueducts brought fresh water from the hills, feeding fountains on nearly every block. You could fill a jug, wash your hands, or cool your feet on a hot day. Wealthier homes even had running water pipe directly inside. People took it for granted, much like they did the mountain that made their lives so good. The Forum was Pompeii's heartbeat. Surrounded by grand columns and statues, it was where politics, gossip, and trade collided. Senators and merchants argued under the same sun as beggars and street performers. From here you could see the Temple of Jupiter standing tall, a constant reminder of the god's watchful eyes. At least that's what people thought was watching them. In the evenings, the city slowed, but didn't sleep. Oil lamps flickered in tavern windows. The smell of roasting meat drifted from kitchens. Couples strolled under the stars, talking softly. Somewhere in the distance you could hear the sea against the shore. And looming over it all, Vesuvius kept its silent vigil, as if it were listening. Pompeii wasn't perfect. The streets were often messy, with animal droppings and bits of trash swept into gutters. Public baths could get crowded, and pickpockets were always ready to take advantage of a distracted visitor. But for most people, the city offered more than it took away. It was a place of opportunity, of good harvests and good company. On festival days, the streets were alive with music and colour. Dancers whirled to the sound of flutes, vendors sold honey cakes and wine, and children wore flower crowns. Temples filled with offerings, baskets of fruit, incense, and little figurines to please the gods. and still the mountain looked on, its slopes green and peaceful. By the Bay of Naples, fishermen hauled in their catch at dawn. The sea was generous here, silverfish, mussels, squid, much of it ended up in Pompeii's markets, fresh and still smelling of salt. Garum factories turned the leftovers into the famous fish sauce loved by Romans everywhere. The smell? Well, let's just say it was an acquired taste. Even the poorer quarters of Pompeii had life in them. Narrow alleys held tiny workshops where craftsmen shaped bronze, hammered silver, or stitched sandals. Taverns sold cheap wine by the cup, served with olives or bread. In the evenings, neighbours gathered in doorways, talking about crops, politics, and the occasional scandal. From the highest rooftops you could see everything, the sea glittering in the distance, the patchwork of vineyards, and the great mountain standing over it all. If someone had told you that mountain would one day destroy the city, you'd have laughed. That kind of thing didn't happen here, not in Pompeii. Pompeii's amphitheatre was one of its crown jewels. Built decades before the Colosseum in Rome, it could seat thousands. On game days, the roar of the crowd carried through the streets. Vendors sold nuts and wine, and families settled in to watch gladiators clash in the dusty arena. The locals were proud of it, proud enough to paint scenes of fights on their walls at home. Wealthy residents lived in sprawling homes decorated with intricate mosaics and vivid frescoes. Gardens bloomed inside open courtyards, with fountains splashing gently in the shade. Statues of gods and heroes watched over these spaces. To walk through one was to see a blend of nature, art, and luxury. A private paradise for those who could afford it. But for every grand villa, there were rows of modest homes and some old shops. Life was lived in the open here. Bakers kept their doors wide so passers-by could smell the bread. Cobblers worked where customers could watch. Even arguments spilled into the streets, drawing small crowds eager for a bit of drama. The streets themselves told stories. Wheel ruts carved deep into the stone from years of carts passing. White stepping stones across the roads kept sandals dry when rainwater flowed down the gutters. Every block had its own rhythm, some quiet, some full of clamour. It was a city that never felt entirely still. And always there was the mountain. The quiet, green, beautiful mountain. People toasted to it over wine, picnicked on its slopes, and thanked it for their good harvests. No one imagined it would one day be the end of everything they knew. For now, Vesuvius was simply part of the view, the most reliable neighbour in Pompeii. Before it was the proud Roman city of Pompeii, this land had seen many masters. The first settlers were the Oscans, an Italic tribe who built simple huts here centuries before Rome even dreamed of empire. They liked the location: fertile land, fresh water, and a coastline not too far away. In time, other cultures would take notice. Then came the Etruscans. Skilled traders and builders, they brought new ideas and connections to far-off lands. They were followed by the Greeks, who arrived not as conquerors, but as neighbours. The Greeks brought their art, their temples, and, perhaps most importantly, their wine culture. You could say this was the start of Pompeii's love affair with grapes. The Greeks weren't just about wine, they brought theatre, philosophy and architecture. Even after they were gone, you could still see their influence in Pompeii's buildings and art. A column here, a mosaic pattern there. Whispers of a time when Greek culture ruled the Mediterranean. By the 5th century BCE, another Italic tribe, the Samnites, had taken control. They were tough mountain people, known for their warrior culture. They expanded the city, fortified its walls, and gave it a new political structure. Pompeii was growing in power and importance, but another power was rising in the distance, and it wouldn't be long before Pompeii fell under its shadow. That power, of course, was Rome. At first, Pompeii was just another ally in Rome's expanding network, but alliances with Rome tended to end the same way, with Rome in charge. The social war of 91-88 BC saw Pompeii rebel, along with other Italian cities, demanding full citizenship. Rome's legions came, battered its walls, and eventually claimed it as their own. The aftermath was surprisingly beneficial for Pompeii. Once Rome granted citizenship in 89 BCE, the city became a Roman colony. New settlers arrived, streets were repaired, and the local economy plugged straight into Rome's massive trade network. Life changed, but it changed in a way that brought more wealth, especially for those who knew how to play Rome's game. Roman influence swept through every part of the city. Temples were rebuilt in the Roman style. Latin replaced older languages in official writing. Public baths appeared, funded by wealthy patrons eager to show off. The amphitheatre, built in 70 BC, became the pride of the city, a place where everyone could watch games under the Mediterranean sun. Pompeii's Forum became a miniature version of Rome's own, a grand open square lined with columns, statues and important buildings. Here, politics, trade, and religion met in one noisy, crowded space. It was where you might see a senator one moment and a fishmonger the next. The Romans also brought organisation. Streets were laid out in a neat grid, with raised sidewalks and stepping stones to cross in wet weather. Water flowed from aqueducts into public fountains. Even the sewers got an upgrade, not glamorous but vital for a growing city. Of course, Roman rule wasn't all marble columns and fancy baths. Taxes were higher and loyalty to Rome was expected. But for most Pompeians, the benefits outweighed the costs. They had Roman citizenship, access to wider markets, and the prestige of being part of the empire. In their eyes, they had traded up. As the years passed, Pompeii became a fusion city, still holding on to Greek influences in its art, still shaped by its Oscan and Samnite past, but unmistakably Roman in its politics, architecture, and ambition. It was a layered place, each culture leaving its mark like a fresco painted over another. By the 1st century CE, Pompeii had found its rhythm. The old defensive walls were more decoration than necessity. The city's energy turned towards trade, culture, and leisure. And above it all, as always, stood Mount Vesuvius, the silent witness to centuries of change, its true nature still a secret to everyone living in its shadow. The first light of dawn stretched over Pompeii, spilling gold across the red-tiled roofs. Roosters crowed from somewhere behind the garden walls, and the smell of baking bread drifted into the streets. The city was waking up. Merchants unbarred their shop doors, servants swept yesterday's dust into the gutters, and somewhere a dog barked at nothing in particular. The marketplace, the Forum, stirred to life early. Farmers from the countryside rolled in with carts piled high with figs, grapes, and fresh greens. Fishmongers slapped their morning catch onto marble counters, the silver scales glistening. Shouts of prices filled the air, and customers haggled with the same passion they reserved for politics. Bakers worked the earliest shift in the city. The scent of bread was their calling card, pulling customers in before they even saw the shop. Inside, massive stone mills turned by donkeys ground wheat into flour, while ovens glowed with heat. Some loaves were plain, others stamped with the baker's mark, a promise of quality, or at least of freshness. By mid-morning the streets hummed with traffic. Carts creaked over the cobblestones, wheel ruts deep from years of wear. Children darted between legs, chasing each other with sticks. Water splashed from fountains as women filled jugs, balancing them expertly on their hips. Shops lined the main streets, their goods spilling onto the pavement. Cobbler stalls with rows of sandals, bronze workshops with gleaming oil lamps, spice cellars surrounded by the scent of cinnamon and pepper. Shopkeepers knew their customers by name, and by how much credit they could be trusted with. For many, a quick bite came from the thermopolia, street food counters. Large clay jars set into the counter held hot stews, wine and olives. A hungry customer could eat standing right there, gossiping with friends or take a jug home to share. These places were noisy, cheap and always busy. Public baths were another hub of daily life. People came to relax, to socialise and, let's be honest, to show off a little. You could soak in hot pools, cool off in cold ones, or sweat it out in the steam room. Business deals were made here as often as friendships. In the quieter back streets, artisans worked in small workshops. Potters spun clay into jars, jewellers hammered gold into bracelets, and painters bent over bright frescoes. The smell of dye, wet clay, and fresh paint mixed in the air, the perfume of Pompeii's creativity. Wealthy residents enjoyed the luxury of private gardens hidden behind tall walls. These were oases of shade and fragrance. Fountains burbled, flowers bloomed, and citrus trees dangled their fruit overhead. Here, the city's noise faded into the background. Lunch in Pompeii was rarely rushed. Workers might grab bread and cheese in the shade of a fountain, while the wealthy reclined at home, eating olives, figs, and roasted meats. Wine, watered down for daytime drinking, was a store of every skill. Afternoons slowed down. The sun grew hot, and even the busiest streets grew quieter. Merchants leaned in their doorways, fanning themselves. Children napped in the shade. The hum of cicadas filled the air, blending with the distant crash of waves. As the heat eased, the amphitheatre drew crowds. Gladiators clashed in the dusty arena, cheered on by citizens who packed the stone seating. Vendors moved through the aisles with trays of nuts, bread, and wine. The noise rose like a wave with each clash of swords. Evenings in Pompeii were made for socialising. Taverns lit their lamps and streets glowed with warm light. Musicians played flutes and lyres, while friends gathered over jugs of wine to talk politics, poetry, or neighbourhood gossip. In the quieter quarters, families gathered around small tables for supper. Simple meals of beans, bread, and fish filled the air with comforting smells. Children chattered about their day while parents exchanged knowing looks over the flicker of a single lamp. As the city settled into night, the moon rose over Vesuvius. From the rooftops, you could see the whole sweep of the Bay of Naples, silver under the starlight. Pompeii slept peacefully, unaware that its days of calm and plenty would not last forever. For those still awake, the city after dark had its own rhythm. Lovers walked quietly along the moonlit streets. The distant sound of a lyre floated from an open window. Somewhere in the forum, a night watchman's footsteps echoed against the marble. Pompeii was never completely silent. It only softened its voice. Even the poorest quarters found joy at day's end. Neighbours leaned on doorframes, trading stories. Children too excited to sleep chased each other in the alleys, their laughter mixing with the smell of bread still warm from the ovens. Life here was modest for many, but far from joyless. From the hills outside the city, the view was breathtaking. Pompeii's lights twinkled below, the dark shape of Vesuvius standing over it like a sleeping giant. Farmers heading home from late work glanced down at the city, proud to be part of its life, never imagining it could be gone in a day. Back in the taverns, the last customers lingered over wine, reluctant to leave. They spoke of harvests, of politics in Rome, of rumours about grain prices. The clink of cups and the murmur of conversation carried into the night air until the lamps finally went out one by one. And so another day in Pompeii came to an end. The city slept beneath its blanket of stars, Mount Vesuvius silent and still. Tomorrow life would begin again much the same. The market would open, the baths would steam, the amphitheatre would roar. For now only the whisper of the sea kept the city company. Pompeii was a city of 20,000 souls, and not all of them were equal. The streets carried senators and slaves, merchants and beggars, priests and pickpockets, often within a few steps of each other. Status mattered, but life was shared in the same markets, the same baths, and under the same mountain. At the top stood the patricians, wealthy landowners and political figures. They lived in sprawling villas, their floors a patchwork of mosaics, but their walls glowing with painted scenes. Servants carried food to them, and their robes were bright with expensive dyes. When they walked, people noticed. Just below them were the merchants and artisans. These were the people who made the city move: bakers, potters, bronze workers, cloth dyers. Many were rich in their own right. Their wealth built one sale at a time. A clever tradesman could live almost like a noble, especially if he knew the right people. Then came the freedmen, former slaves who had bought or earned their freedom. They could never hold high office, but they could run businesses, own property, and live respectably. Many freedmen became wealthy through trade, proving that in Pompeii your start didn't always decide your finish. Slaves were the invisible engine of the city. They cooked, cleaned, built, and served. Some were educated scribes or skilled artisans. Others laboured in the fields or carried loads in the streets. A few were treated kindly, many were not. Their lives depended entirely on the household they served. Women in Pompeii had more freedom than in many other places in the ancient world. They could own property, run businesses, and manage estates. In the market, you could see women selling goods or negotiating prices with the same confidence as any man. For wealthy women, life was often lived behind the high walls of their villas, managing the household, hosting gatherings, and ensuring the family's public image remained spotless. But even there, women could wield quiet power, influencing their husbands' decisions in ways never written down in official histories. Children were everywhere, playing knucklebones in the street, chasing dogs, running errands for their parents. Wealthy boys studied Latin and Greek, learning rhetoric and law. Girls, if educated, often learned reading, music, and household management. Poor children learned trades early, working alongside their parents. Foreigners added to Pompeii's colourful mix. Sailors from Alexandria, traders from Gaul, travellers from Greece, all passed through. some staying long enough to call the city home. Their languages and customs blended into daily life, making Pompeii a true crossroads of the Mediterranean. Priests and priestesses tended the city's many temples, offering sacrifices to Jupiter, Venus, Apollo, and countless other deities. Religion was woven into daily life. You might thank Mercury for a good sail or pray to Neptune before a fishing trip. Entertainers roamed the streets, musicians, dancers, and storytellers who performed for coins. In the amphitheatre, gladiators became local celebrities, their victories celebrated and their losses mourned. Even chariot racers had fan clubs, complete with graffiti declaring loyalty. Doctors and healers worked in small clinics, armed with herbs, bronze tools, and a mix of science and superstition. Some were skilled, others less so. A lucky patient left with a cure, an unlucky one left with a story. Not everyone in Pompeii was honest. Thieves worked the crowded markets, slipping hands into coin purses. Conmen sold miracle cures that cured nothing. The city guard kept order when they could, but crime, like the sea, was always there. Public servants, from magistrates to street cleaners, kept the city running. Some positions were glamorous, others thankless. But in a city this size, every role mattered. Even the man sweeping the forum knew he was part of something bigger. Graffiti revealed Pompeii's personality. Walls were covered in love notes, insults, political slogans, and boasts. Gaius loves Julia might sit right next to vote for Marcus, or the best bread is at Faustus's shop. It was the ancient version of social media, public, messy, and often hilarious. The poor made do with what they had. Crowded rooms above shops, second-hand clothing, meals of bread and beans. But they had the same sunsets, the same festivals, and the same mountain view as the rich, which on most days felt like enough. On festival days, everyone came together, rich and poor, slave and free, all filled the streets to watch parades, eat sweets, and give thanks to the gods. For a little while, status blurred and the city became one big, noisy family. In the end, Pompeii was more than buildings and streets. It was its people, loud, opinionated, clever, stubborn, joyful, flawed. They lived under the same sky, worked the same land, and shared the same fate that none of them could see coming. If you could stand in the middle of the forum and watch the crowd pass by, you'd see the whole city in miniature. The wealthy, the working, the enslaved, the free, each face with its own story, each one about to become part of a greater tragic story together. And so the people of Pompeii lived their lives under the shadow of a mountain they thought was their friend. They worked, loved, fought, laughed, and dreamed. They had no idea that history would remember them not for what they did in life, but for the way their lives ended. Pompeii wasn't just a city, it was a canvas. Everywhere you looked, the walls, floors, and even ceilings were alive with colour and design. Frescoes turned plain plaster into windows to myth, nature, and daily life. The city didn't believe in bare walls. Why settle for empty space when you could have a painting of Venus or a hunting scene staring back at you? The House of the Faun was one of Pompeii's grandest homes, sprawling rooms, private gardens, and a floor mosaic so famous it still steals attention today, the Alexander mosaic, showing Alexander the Great charging into battle. Imagine stepping into your hallway and seeing history unfold beneath your feet. Mosaics were a Pompeian obsession. Tiny pieces of stone or glass, tesserae, came together to form images so detailed they looked like paintings. You'd find them in grand villas and humble homes alike, showing everything from epic myths to a simple bowl of fruit. Public buildings were no less decorated. The baths, for example, had ceilings painted with intricate patterns, walls coated in rich red and yellow plaster, and marble benches that stayed cool in the summer. Even a quick wash felt like an event. Temples stood as architectural statements to the gods. The Temple of Jupiter, dominating the forum, rose on a high podium, its columns reaching toward the sky. From its steps, you could see the whole city, and be seen by the whole city in return. The Temple of Apollo was older, blending Greek and Roman design. Statues of the gods stood between tall columns, a reminder of Pompeii's mixed heritage. The courtyard was open to the sun, so each visit felt like stepping into the god's own domain. Private villas took luxury to another level. Take the Villa of the Mysteries, famous for its mysterious red frescoes showing an initiation ritual, possibly into the cult of Dionysus. The figures were life-size, their eyes following you as you walked. It was both beautiful and unsettling. Architecture in Pompeii was clever too. Homes were built around open-air atriums, with rainwater collected in a pool called the impluvium. This design kept the house cool and let sunlight reach the inner rooms. It was beauty-serving function. Even humble shops had their flair. A baker might have a painted sign showing loaves of bread, while a tavern might feature a fresco of a wine jug. Pompeii's streets were an open gallery, every wall an opportunity for art or advertising. The colours were bold, deep reds, bright blues, warm yellows. These pigments came from minerals and plants, some imported from far away. They weren't afraid to spend for beauty. A well-painted room said as much about a homeowner's status as their clothing or jewellery. Sculptures were everywhere. Marble gods in gardens, bronze busts in courtyards, stone lions guarding the fountains. Some were finely crafted by famous artists, others were local work, but all added a sense of grandeur to the spaces they occupied. The amphitheatre was not just an entertainment venue, it was a monument to Roman engineering. Its stone arches and tiered seating were built to last, and the painted frescoes on its walls celebrated the games played inside. Public fountains doubled as art pieces. Many were carved from volcanic stone topped with animal heads or gods' faces. Water poured from bronze spouts into stone basins where children splashed and women filled jugs. Even the streets had artistic touches. White stones were set into the road to catch the moonlight, guiding nighttime travellers. Decorative paving marked important public spaces. Pompeii's beauty wasn't just in private homes, it was shared with the whole city. In some homes, art took playful turns. You might find a fresco of a pet dog with the warning, "Cave Canem, beware of the dog," or a mosaic showing a basket of bread so realistic you'd swear it was fresh from the oven. Gardens were designed as living art. Paths wound through flowering plants, fountains whispered in the shade, and painted walls extended the scenery with illusions of open landscapes. Step inside and you could forget you were in the middle of a bustling city. Some frescoes were less about gods and nature and more about pleasure. Erotic art decorated bedrooms and bathhouses, not hidden away but proudly displayed. In Pompeii, beauty and desire were often intertwined. Workshops producing art thrived here. Painters mixed pigments in small bowls, mosaic makers cut stone into tiny cubes, and sculptors shaped marble with careful strikes. Every finished piece had a buyer waiting. Pompeii's art and architecture told stories of myths, of history, of the owners themselves. A villa's decorations could whisper of wealth, taste, and ambitions without saying a word. When the city fell, its art froze in place, colours still bright, mosaics still gleaming. Today they are windows into a world where beauty was everywhere, and where even a wall could tell a story. Religion in Pompeii was everywhere. It wasn't just in the temples, it was in kitchens, street corners, gardens and shop walls. The gods were part of the furniture here, woven into daily life so deeply that you couldn't walk more than a few steps without seeing their presence. The Temple of Jupiter stood proudly in the Forum, constant reminder of Rome's might. Its marble columns rose high above the market, and from its steps you could look over the whole city. Jupiter wasn't just a god here, he was the ultimate authority, watching over trade deals, speeches, and the occasional heated argument. Pompeii also honoured Venus, the city's patron goddess. Her temple sat near the harbour, a fitting spot for the goddess of love, beauty and prosperity. Sailors might leave offerings before a voyage, hoping her blessings would carry them safely across the sea. The Temple of Apollo was one of the oldest in the city, blending Greek and Roman design. Bronze statues of the god stood under open skies, bow in hand as if guarding the Forum. Musicians sometimes played here, letting their melodies drift between the columns. Religion wasn't only public. Most homes had a lararium, a small household shrine dedicated to the Lars, guardian spirits, and Penates, protectors of the pantry. Every morning, families left a bit of food or wine there, a polite thank you for keeping the house safe. Festivals were a major part of religious life. Streets filled with processions, priests carrying statues of gods, musicians playing flutes and drums, citizens tossing flowers. It was half devotion, half street party, and the whole city turned out to watch. Sacrifices were common, and not just in temples. A priest might bless an ox or sheep before offering it to the gods, the smoke carrying prayers upward. Smaller offerings, incense, cakes, or fruit, were everyday gestures of respect. Pompeii's people didn't worship just Roman gods. Foreign deities had their place too. The Temple of Isis, an Egyptian goddess, was a popular spot, especially among women and freedmen. Its cool, painted walls and sacred pool offered a sense of mystery and belonging. Mystery cults were another thread in Pompeii's spiritual fabric. These secretive groups promised special knowledge, better fortunes, or a blessed afterlife, but only to the initiated. Outsiders could only guess what went on inside. Religion was tied to the calendar. Each month brought festivals, holy days, and rites. Farmers prayed for rain, fishermen for calm seas, merchants for luck in trade. The gods were busy, and so were the priests who served them. Superstitions thrived alongside official worship. People carried amulets against the evil eye, hung charms over their doors, and avoided unlucky days for weddings or business deals. The line between religion and magic was thin. Public altars dotted the streets. You might pass one on your way to the baths and stop to toss a pinch of grain into the flame. It was quick, casual, and as natural as saying hello to a neighbour. The gods were everywhere in art. Mosaics showed Neptune with his trident. Frescoes painted Mercury with his winged hat. Statues captured Mars in bronze. Even taverns had paintings of Bacchus raising a cup of wine. Omens and signs mattered. A sudden flock of birds, a strange dream, or an unusual pattern in the entrails of a sacrificed animal. These were messages, and people took them seriously. Decisions could be made or delayed based on a single sign. Religion also shaped law. Oaths were sworn before the gods, and breaking them meant divine as well as legal punishment. A dishonest deal wasn't just a crime, it was an insult to the heavens. On certain nights, processions carried torches through the streets, chanting hymns to drive away evil spirits. The flicker of light against the stone walls made the city look both magical and a little eerie. Some worship was deeply personal. A fisherman might whisper to Neptune before casting his net. A mother might touch the feet of a Venus statue for her daughter's marriage. These private moments were the quiet heartbeat of Pompeii's faith. Not every prayer was answered, of course, but for the people of Pompeii, worship wasn't about guarantees, it was about respect. The gods had given them fertile land, a thriving city, and beauty all around. They owed it to them to give thanks, and so the gods watched over Pompeii from the highest temple to the smallest street shrine. The people believed the gods kept them safe, even as the ground sometimes shook and the mountain loomed quietly above. No one could know that the gods they trusted wouldn't stop the ash when it came. But in those last peaceful years, religion was the thread that tied Pompeii together, from the harbour to the hills, from the rich to the poor. If Pompeii had a soundtrack, it would start in the bakeries at dawn. The deep grind of donkey-powered mills, the clatter of wooden paddles against stone ovens, the soft crackle of bread crusts forming in the heat. This was breakfast in the making. Bread wasn't just food, it was survival. Some loaves were plain, others flavoured with olives or nuts. Wealthy citizens might enjoy bread sprinkled with poppy seeds or drizzled with honey. Poorer families often dipped theirs into wine or watered down vinegar for flavour. Speaking of wine, in Pompeii it was everywhere. The fertile volcanic soil around Mount Vesuvius grew grapes so rich they were famous across the empire. Wine was rarely drunk straight. It was usually watered down, sometimes flavoured with herbs, honey, or even seawater. Taverns and wine shops, called popinae, lined the busy streets. Counters held big clay jars called dolia filled with wine, stews, and snacks. The air smelled of garlic, roasting meat, and spilled wine, an aroma that promised both pleasure and a possible headache in the morning. Street food was a way of life. Thermopolia offered hot stews, sausages, bread, and olives to go. Fishermen sold fresh oysters right on the dock. On festival days, honey cakes were the treat of choice, sticky, sweet, and gone in 2 bites. The markets were feasts for the senses. Stalls overflowed with figs, dates, pomegranates, garlic, onions, cheese, and fresh fish. The shouts of merchants, the clink of coins, the smell of herbs and citrus. This was Pompeii's pantry, open to everyone. Entertainment wasn't just for the wealthy. The amphitheatre could hold 20,000 people, almost the entire city. Gladiators fought under the hot sun, their armour gleaming, the crowd roaring with every blow. It was loud, bloody, and wildly popular. Gladiators weren't all slaves. Some were volunteers chasing fame and fortune. Successful ones had fans, graffiti dedicated to them, and gifts from admirers. They were the sports stars of their day, bruised, scarred, and adored. Animal hunts were another crowd favourite. Lions, leopards, and even crocodiles were brought in for shows. The animals rarely survived, but the thrill of danger kept the stands packed. Theatre performances offered something different: music, comedy, tragedy. The large theatre and the smaller Odeon hosted plays in Greek and Latin. Actors wore masks, and the audience often shouted back, sometimes more entertained by heckling than the show. Music filled the city: flutes, lyres, drums, and cymbals played at feasts, weddings, and festivals. Street musicians earned coins in the markets, and travelling performers brought new songs from far-off lands. Public baths doubled as social clubs. People came to soak, gossip, and negotiate deals in steamy rooms decorated with frescoes. Bathhouses had hot pools, cold plunges, saunas, and even gyms for exercise before a soak. Board games were another pastime. People played dice, knucklebones, and a strategy game called Ludus Latrunculorum, similar to chess. It was common to see two men hunched over a board in a tavern corner, eyes narrowed and guided in concentration. During festivals, the streets became a playground. Jugglers tossed coloured balls, acrobats flipped in the air, and costumed dancers paraded to drum beats. It was loud, chaotic, and wonderful. Some entertainment was more private: lavish dinner parties in wealthy homes. Guests reclined on couches, servants brought course after course, and musicians played while poets recited verses between dishes. Food at these dinners could be extravagant: roasted peacock, dormice rolled in honey and poppy seeds, seafood platters stacked high. The wine flowed freely, and so did the conversation. For ordinary Pompeians, evening meant a trip to the tavern. Cheap wine, warm bread, and simple stews were enough. The laughter and arguments spilling out into the street could last until the oil lamps burned low. Gambling was a guilty pleasure for many. Dice games were technically illegal in some cases, which only made them more popular. Winners left grinning, losers claimed the dice were cursed. And then there was the wine again, always the wine. By the end of a good night, songs drifted through the streets, and the city seemed wrapped in its own warm haze. Pompeii knew how to eat, drink, and enjoy life. No one realised how fragile it all was. The bread, the wine, the laughter in the taverns, it all felt eternal. In the shadow of the mountain, Pompeii believed its pleasures would last forever. In the summer of 79 CE, Pompeii looked the same as ever. The markets bustled, the baths steamed, and the taverns poured wine. But in the background, something had shifted. The mountain, Vesuvius, seemed to brood a little more, as if watching the city with a new kind of patience. It wasn't the first time the earth had spoken. 17 years earlier, in 62 CE, a massive earthquake had shaken Pompeii to its foundations. Walls cracked, temples collapsed, and entire districts had to be rebuilt. People said it was the work of angry gods, but life had returned to normal soon enough. Even after that quake, smaller tremors had rattled the city from time to time. Most Pompeians barely reacted anymore. A jolt, a shiver in the ground, a few falling tiles, it was just part of living here, like rain or wind. In the weeks before the eruption, animals began acting strangely. Dogs barked at nothing, birds abandoned their nests, and even the rats seemed to vanish from the streets. Most people didn't notice, and those who did simply shrugged. Animals were always restless in summer heat. The air sometimes carried a faint sulphur smell, drifting down from the mountain. It wasn't strong, just enough to wrinkle the nose before disappearing. Locals blamed it on swamp gases or changes in the wind. Fountains and wells occasionally ran muddy, and the water tasted metallic. Priests offered extra prayers at the temples, but no one suspected these were warnings from deep beneath their feet. Farmers noticed their crops were behaving oddly. Grapes ripened too early. Figs came in smaller than usual, and some plants withered despite regular watering. They blamed the weather, not the restless ground below. Some mornings, a thin plume of smoke rose from Vesuvius. It wasn't dramatic, just a grey smudge against the sky. People barely looked up from their errands. Mountains breathed, didn't they? Merchants arriving by sea spoke of strange currents and unusually warm water in the bay. Fishermen claimed the fish were swimming deeper, harder to catch, but these were dismissed as sailors' tales. The ground occasionally rumbled deep and low, like distant thunder. It was easy to ignore in the daylight, but at night, when the streets were quiet, those sounds felt closer, as if the mountain was clearing its throat. A few people grew uneasy. A philosopher visiting from Naples warned of underground fires and the need to leave. Most Pompeians found his warnings amusing. Leave this? The fertile fields, the busy harbour, the life they knew? Not likely. Priests performed extra sacrifices, just in case. Smoke from burning incense curled into the sky, mingling with the faint haze from the mountain. It looked almost like the gods themselves were speaking, but no one could agree on what they were saying. In the last days, tremors became more frequent. A cup might rattle on a table, a roof tile might clatter to the street. People joked about it. Better the ground shake than the tax collector's hand. Humour was easier than fear. The animals grew more frantic. Dogs refused to enter buildings, goats bleated all night, and horses stamped and kicked in their stalls. Some owners tied them tighter, others let them roam, thinking fresh air would calm them. One night a strange red glow was seen on the mountain's peak. Some called it moonlight on the clouds. Others whispered of Vulcan, the god of fire, working his forge beneath the earth. Few thought to pack their belongings. The day before the eruption, the air felt heavy and still. Birds were silent, the usual sea breeze never came. It was as if the whole city was holding its breath, waiting for something no one could name. That night, the dogs barked again. People tossed in their sleep, dreams filled with strange images. Waves swallowing the shore, fire raining from the sky. No one knew these were memories of the future, knocking early. In the early hours, a low roar came from the mountain. Most slept through it. Those awake thought it was a storm forming out at sea, but no rain came. The signs had been there, in the smoke, the tremors, the restless animals. But when danger creeps slowly, it's easy to pretend it isn't there. And so, on the morning of August 24th, 79 CE, Pompeii woke to an ordinary day. By nightfall, the city would never be the same. But for now, the warning signs faded into the background, swallowed by the sound of carts on stone, laughter in taverns, and the unshakable belief that tomorrow would come. It began without warning. Just after mid-morning on August 24th, 79 CE, Mount Vesuvius let out a sound no one in Pompeii had ever heard before. A deep rolling thunder from inside the earth. Then, with a shudder, the mountain split open and a column of smoke and ash shot into the sky. At first, people didn't know what they were seeing. The column climbed higher and higher, twisting like a giant pine tree, black at the base, grey in the middle, white at the top where steam curled in the sunlight. It was beautiful in a terrible way. Then the ash began to fall, soft at first, like grey snowflakes drifting from the sky. People brushed it off their shoulders, laughed nervously, and went inside, but it didn't stop. Within an hour, the ash thickened into gritty flakes that stung the eyes and filled the mouth. Roof tiles rattled under its weight. Some people headed for the harbour, others stayed indoors, thinking it would pass. From the mountain came the sound of cracking stone, like the world itself was breaking. Pumice stones, some as small as a fist, others the size of a melon, began to rain down. They smashed through tiles, shattered jars, and sent people running for cover. The sky grew darker. By midday, the sun was only a pale disk behind a ceiling of ash. Oil lamps were lit in homes and shops. The city felt as if night had fallen far too early. Some tried to flee toward the sea, but the shoreline was choked with people. Boats were scarce, and the water churned with strange waves. Pliny the Elder, across the bay in Misenum, ordered ships to rescue survivors, though few would reach them in time. Others ran inland along the roads, but the falling pumice made every step harder. Carts overturned, animals panicked, and the air grew thick with dust. People wrapped cloth over their mouths, coughing and stumbling. Inside the city, those who stayed indoors could hear the steady hiss of ash falling on roofs, like rain, but heavier, more menacing. Every so often there was a crash as a roof caved in under the weight. By afternoon, the streets were knee-deep in pumice. Every step was a struggle. People waded through it, dragging carts and children, trying not to sink. The city was becoming a trap. The air grew hotter. The ash falling from the sky was warm now, and the pumice stones burned to the touch. It felt as though the mountain was leaning closer. Some residents sought shelter in the amphitheatre, thinking its stone walls would protect them. Others huddled in the baths, cellars, or temples. They didn't yet know that the danger would soon come from the ground, not just the sky. By evening, the ash cloud stretched for miles, blotting out the horizon. Lightning crackled inside it, flashes of blue-white tearing through the black. The mountain roared like a living thing. Families clung to each other in the dark, their oil lamps flickering in the thick air. The smell of sulphur was strong now, mixed with the choking dust. Breathing became harder with every passing hour. In the harbour, waves pounded the shore as if trying to drive people back toward the city. Some boats overturned, spilling their passengers into the dark water. By nightfall, the sky was pure black. The only light came from the fires on Vesuvius and the brief sparks of volcanic lightning. Ash fell without pause. It was no longer possible to tell where the mountain ended and the sky began. Those still outside felt the ground tremble again. Some thought it was another earthquake, but it was something worse. The first signs of the pyroclastic surges to come. The mountain was building toward its deadliest breath. People prayed aloud, calling to Jupiter, to Venus, to any god who might listen. But the gods stayed silent, their temples buried deeper with every passing hour. The air was now so thick with dust that breathing felt like swallowing fire. Many wrapped wet cloths over their mouths, their voices hoarse from coughing. For them, the night stretched endlessly, each minute heavier than the last. By midnight, Pompeii was no longer a city of lights and voices. It was a shadow under a storm, waiting in the dark for the next blow. The mountain had only begun. By dawn on the second day, the streets of Pompeii were unrecognisable. Roofs had caved in, walls leaned at dangerous angles, and the ground was buried under metres of pumice. Those still alive faced a choice: run, or hope the walls around them could keep out the mountain's wrath. Some gathered what they could carry, coins, jewellery, a loaf of bread, and headed for the gates. Others left with nothing, knowing speed mattered more than possessions. The roads out of the city were treacherous. Pumice slid underfoot like gravel, carts overturned in the drifts, and the air was still thick enough to choke on. People stumbled, fell, and got back up, driven by the hope that somewhere beyond the ash, graffiti waited. Others tried for the harbour, but the sea was rough and choked with floating debris. The few ships that had braved the coast were already full, their decks crowded with desperate faces. Inside the city, some chose to stay in basements and storerooms, convinced the danger would pass. They braced doors with barrels, wrapped themselves in blankets, and prayed the mountain would grow tired before it reached them. The first pyroclastic surge arrived without warning, a wall of scorching gas and ash rolling down the slope faster than a man could run. It tore through Herculaneum first, swallowing the town in seconds before moving toward Pompeii. In Pompeii, the surge arrived like a sudden storm. The air turned to fire, the sky to stone. Those outside didn't even have time to scream before the heat and ash silenced everything. Inside, the heat seeped through the stone walls, filling rooms with choking dust. Lamps went out. In the darkness, people clung to one another, their world reduced to the sound of their own heartbeat and the roar outside. The surge passed as quickly as it came, leaving behind silence broken only by the crackle of fires. For a moment, survivors thought it might be over. Then the ground trembled again. A second surge came faster and hotter. It raced through those gates, down the streets, and into every open space. The air itself seemed to burn, and even stone walls offered little refuge. Some tried to outrun it, sprinting down alleys, leaping over rubble. But the surge moved like liquid fire, wrapping around corners, chasing every path. In the harbour, those still waiting for rescue saw the cloud coming over the city and toward the shore. Many leapt into the water, hoping the sea could shield them. It couldn't. By now, the city was almost unrecognisable. Buildings were half buried, streets blocked by rubble, and the air so thick it turned day into night. Somewhere beneath the ash, voices still called for help, then faded. The third surge was the most devastating. It roared down the mountain with the force of an avalanche, collapsing walls, snapping columns, and sweeping away anything still standing. Those hidden in cellars were entombed as the ash piled higher, sealing doors and windows. The air inside grew unbreathable. In the end, most simply lay down beside their loved ones. A few managed to reach the city's outskirts, but the surges caught many even there. The heat was enough to kill instantly, the ash enough to bury everything in minutes. By midday, the surges had passed. Vesuvius still fumed, but the killing breath was over. The city lay silent beneath a deep, smouldering blanket, Pompeii's final shroud. Those who had escaped from afar turned to look back. Where their home had stood, there was now only a flat grey plain, with the mountains standing quiet as if nothing had happened. In a single day, the question had been answered for thousands, flight or fate. For most, fate had chosen for them. And so Pompeii vanished beneath the ash, its final moments locked in silence. It would sleep there for nearly 2,000 years, waiting for the day the world would come looking. When the mountain finally quieted, Pompeii was gone. Not destroyed in the way of burned ruins or toppled walls. Gone. Hidden. The city lay under a thick grey blanket, still warm to the touch in places, its streets buried so deep you could walk over them without knowing what was below. The ash had fallen in layers, light and powdery at the top, heavier and compact below. Pumice stones lay scattered like fallen stars, their sharp edges catching the weak sunlight. No birds sang, no footsteps echoed. Fires still smouldered in pockets around the city. Collapsed kitchens, fallen roof beams, storage rooms where oil had ignited. The smoke mixed with the mountain's fading steam, curling into the still air like ghosts reluctant to leave. The outlines of buildings were faint ridges in the ash, their rooftops long vanished beneath the weight. Entire courtyards, gardens and fountains had disappeared without a trace. The city's shape was now only a memory. Inside the ash, the city was preserved in eerie detail. Tables still held cups, lamps sat unlit, loaves of bread lay on counters, frozen in the moment the ash had sealed them away. The dead lay where they had fallen, in the streets, in doorways, curled beside walls. The ash had hardened around them, capturing the shapes of their final moments. Centuries later, their outlines would tell stories too haunting to forget. Beyond the city, the countryside bore the same fate. Vineyards were flattened under grey drifts, olive trees half buried, streams clogged with silt. What had been green and alive was now a muted, endless grey. The harbour was choked with floating debris, pieces of roofs, shattered carts, the remains of boats that had tried to escape. The shoreline was pushed outward by layers of ash, the bay smaller now than it had been the day before. In the silence that followed, the mountain stood calm, as though nothing had happened. Its slopes were scarred, the top reshaped by the eruption, but the plume had vanished, leaving only a faint haze. For days the ground stayed warm and the air tasted faintly of sulphur. No one dared to return. The few who had escaped watched from the hills, unwilling to believe the city could be so completely gone. Rain came eventually, turning the top layers of ash into a pale crust. It hardened in the sun, sealing the city even tighter. Pompeii was no longer just buried, it was entombed. No sounds of rebuilding followed. No merchants returned to set up stalls, no children played in the streets. The city was gone from the map, left to the mountain and the silence. The eruption had done more than destroy, and it had preserved. Beneath the ash, colours still clung to walls, bread still held its shape, and even the graffiti on the tavern walls waited to be read again. But no one knew that then. To those alive in the year 79 CE, Pompeii was simply gone, like a story cut short in the middle of a sentence, with no one left to finish it. The mountain's quiet was the cruelest part. After such fury, its stillness felt like mockery. Birds began to return, perching on the ashen slopes as if nothing had happened. In the days that followed, survivors wandered the surrounding countryside looking for lost family members. Some walked toward where Pompeii had been, only to find nothing but grey hills and silence. The city's name faded from everyday speech. Merchants found other ports, farmers planted new fields elsewhere, and the land around Vesuvius began to grow green again, but never with the same trust. Years passed, and the buried city slept under its shroud. Storms came and went, seasons changed, and the world moved on, unaware of the treasures locked away beneath the ash. For Pompeii there would be no rebuilding, no slow return to life. Its streets, its voices, and its people had been sealed away together, left unmatched by time itself. The city was gone, but it was not lost, only hidden, waiting for the day when human hands would dig it out and the world would finally hear its story again. After the eruption, Pompeii's name was whispered for a while among the survivors, but as years passed, the words faded. Merchants no longer marked it on shipping routes. Farmers stopped pointing to its gates. The city was gone, and with it the place it held in people's minds. The land changed. Wind and rain smoothed the sharp lines of the ash mounds. Grass began to grow in the cracks, then shrubs, then trees. To travellers, the buried city looked like nothing more than a stretch of uneven countryside. Generations came and went, each knowing less than the one before. Grandchildren of survivors heard vague stories of a city swallowed by the mountain, but the details blurred into legend. Farmers began to plant vineyards and olive groves over the buried streets. Their roots dug down into the ash, winding between hidden walls and long-forgotten pottery. Sometimes, while ploughing a field, a farmer's blade would strike something hard, a roof tile, a jar, a statue's head. These strange finds were set aside, their origins unknown, and life carried on. The Roman Empire itself began to crumble, and new powers rose. Roads shifted, cities grew elsewhere, and Pompeii's story faded entirely. By the Middle Ages, no one alive could point to where the city had stood. Monasteries kept vague mentions in dusty manuscripts, but they were little more than footnotes. The land itself gave no obvious clues. It was quiet farmland, dotted with stone farmhouses, grazing sheep and rows of crops. Travellers passed through without a second thought. Centuries rolled by. Storms came, plagues swept through, kingdoms rose and fell, all while Pompeii slept just meters below the soil, unchanged, waiting. Occasionally, someone digging a well or laying a foundation would uncover an ancient wall, still painted with bright colours. They'd marvel at the craftsmanship, then cover it again. In the Renaissance, a renewed fascination with the ancient world brought scholars to Italy in search of ruins, but Pompeii remained hidden, overshadowed by cities like Rome and Naples. The first hints came in the 16th century, when an underground aqueduct project cut through buried structures near the Sarno River. Workers reported finding strange walls and mosaics, but their location was quickly forgotten. Locals sometimes reused the ancient stones, pulling them from the earth for new buildings, never realising they were dismantling an entire city's remains. In the 1700s, Europe's hunger for classical art grew. Wealthy travellers and collectors scoured Italy for ancient treasures, but Pompeii was still a name lost to history. The real turning point was pure accident. In 1748, workers digging a vineyard stumbled upon walls, frescoes and a street, all perfectly preserved under the ash. They had found Pompeii, though they didn't know it yet. Word spread slowly at first, then with excitement. Scholars arrived, brushes in hand, to clear the ash and reveal a Roman world no one had seen for nearly 700 years. The city that had been lost to time was suddenly alive again, its streets, houses, and even its graffiti speaking across centuries. It was as if the mountain had decided to give back what it had taken. For those first explorers, walking those streets was like stepping through a door into the past. The air smelled of ancient plaster, the sunlight touched colours unseen for centuries. Pompeii's long sleep was over, but the centuries it spent buried were what had kept it so perfectly preserved, turning it into one of the most extraordinary time capsules in history. The world had forgotten Pompeii once. It would not forget again. Its story, from bustling port city to silent tomb, had survived the mountain, the centuries, and the erasing hands of time. The year was 1748, and a group of labourers were digging in a vineyard near the Sarno River. They were after nothing more exotic than water and good soil, but instead, their shovels struck something solid, not rock but brick. At first, they thought it was an old farmhouse. But as more earth came away, a section of painted wall emerged. The colours still bright, the figures lifelike, as though the artist had finished it only yesterday. Word spread quickly through the countryside. Local officials sent for scholars and antiquarians, curious to see this strange ruin buried under metres of volcanic soil. They didn't know it yet, but they had found Pompeii, a city lost to the world for almost 1700 years. Early excavations were clumsy by modern standards. Workers hacked through walls, tore up floors, and carried off statues and mosaics to decorate the palaces of Naples. Preservation was not yet the goal, the display was. Even so, the discoveries were staggering. Entire streets lined with shops and houses, amphorae still stacked in storerooms, fountains that could be coaxed to flow again. They found inscriptions, graffiti and signs, voices from a world that had gone silent in a single day. Names, jokes and prices were scrawled on walls, still legible after all those centuries. Perhaps the most haunting finds were the hollow spaces in the hardened ash. Archaeologists poured plaster into them, revealing the forms of Pompeii's final moments. Men, women and children frozen where they fell. Europe was captivated. Artists painted romantic visions of the doomed city. Writers described walking its streets, imagining the lives that had been cut short. Pompeii became the talk of salons from Paris to London. Kings and queens visited, walking among the ruins in parasols and lace. They marvelled at the villas, the temples and the still bright frescoes, never forgetting that these streets had once echoed with voices. As the decades passed, excavation methods improved. Instead of tearing apart buildings, archaeologists began to dig more carefully, documenting each find and mapping the city. By the mid-1800s, large portions of Pompeii had been uncovered. Visitors could walk down Roman streets, past shops selling bread and wine, past temples and theatres, as if the city were only sleeping. Pompeii became a magnet for artists and scholars. Painters set up easels in the forum, poets scribbled verses in notebooks, and historians combed through the details, piecing together the daily life of Rome's provinces. Even so, tragedy lingered here. The plaster cast reminded everyone that these ruins were not merely picturesque. They were a graveyard, holding the memories of thousands. Some areas of the city were so well preserved that visitors swore they could feel the presence of the people who once lived there. The baker, pulling bread from the oven, the merchant shouting prices, the child chasing a dog. The rediscovery of Pompeii changed archaeology forever. It proved that entire cities could survive under the right conditions, untouched by looters or weather. It also gave an unprecedented look at everyday Roman life, not just the temples and monuments, but the kitchens, bedrooms, and graffiti of ordinary citizens. By the late 19th century, Pompeii had become one of the most famous archaeological sites in the world, drawing visitors from every corner of the globe. The city had been buried for nearly 2 millennia. Now, it was open to the sun again, a place where past and present could walk the same streets. The mountain had tried to erase Pompeii, but in the end, it had only hidden it, preserving it so that centuries later the world could marvel, mourn and remember. When archaeologists first began uncovering Pompeii, they didn't just find ruins, they found a time capsule. The eruption of 79 CE had frozen a city mid-breath, leaving behind an entire Roman world in astonishing detail. Before Pompeii, much of what we knew about Rome came from grand monuments and dusty scrolls. But here was something else, the everyday life of ordinary people preserved in stone, paint and even bread. Walking its streets, archaeologists saw where Romans bought lunch, got haircuts, or shouted political slogans. This wasn't just history, it was sip, fashion, and street noise brought back to life. Graffiti scrawled on walls revealed everything from political endorsements to cheeky jokes and declarations of love. It was proof that ancient Romans were just as sarcastic, romantic, and petty as we are. Household items told their own stories. Cooking pots blackened by fire, bronze lamps shaped like animals, and perfume bottles still holding a faint scent. One bakery still had 81 loaves of bread in its oven, carbonized but intact. You could even see the baker's stamp pressed into the crust. The plaster casts were perhaps the most haunting discoveries. Archaeologists realized that the voids in the hardened ash were the spaces where people had fallen. When the plaster hardened and the soil was removed, human forms emerged. Faces twisted in fear, hands reaching out, families huddled together in their final moments. There were animals too. A dog chained outside its master's home, frozen in a desperate struggle to escape. These casts brought a new dimension to archaeology. History wasn't just dates and ruins, it was real people who had lived and laughed here. From the city's layout, archaeologists learned how Romans designed their urban spaces. Streets were laid out in a grid, with stepping stones for pedestrians and deep grooves for carts. Neighbourhoods were clearly divided by wealth. Grand villas boasted columned courtyards and private gardens, while modest homes were small, cramped, and close to noisy streets. Public spaces like the Forum showed how civic life worked. Temples, markets, and government buildings all clustered in one place, buzzing with activity. The city even had public baths where Romans of all classes mingled, proving hygiene and socializing went hand in hand in the empire. Pompeii also taught the world that ancient art wasn't just statues and marble, it was colour. Frescoes burst with reds, blues and golds, shattering the idea that Rome was all white stone. The city's preservation pushed archaeology into a new era. Before, digs often focused on collecting treasures. After Pompeii, the focus shifted to understanding whole communities. It inspired new excavation methods, slower, more careful, with attention to context. Every coin, pot, and scrap of writing could tell a story. Pompeii's influence spread beyond archaeology. Writers, painters, and filmmakers drew on its frozen drama to tell stories about love, tragedy, and disaster. In a way, Pompeii humanized history. It showed that ancient Romans weren't distant, marble-faced figures. They were bakers, barbers, lovers, and pranksters. And maybe that's the biggest lesson Pompeii taught us. Civilizations are fragile, but the human story, in graffiti, in bread, in a dog's last struggle, endures. Pompeii has outlived emperors, kingdoms, and revolutions. Yet today its greatest enemy isn't a volcano. It's the slow, steady wear of time, weather, and human hands. Wind and rain erode frescoes that once dazzled with colour. Moisture seeps into walls, breaking them from within. The sun bleaches once vivid pigments into pale whispers. Tourism is both a blessing and a curse. Millions come to marvel at the city each year, but each footstep grinds ancient stones a little smoother. Each curious hand leaves behind oils and wear. Pollution from nearby cities drifts over the ruins, mixing with rain to form acids that eat away at marble and plaster. The damage is invisible at first, then heartbreakingly obvious. To combat these threats, preservation teams work year-round. Some stabilise crumbling walls, others seal fragile paintings behind glass, or limit access to certain houses altogether. In 1997, Pompeii was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site, joining a global list of places considered vital to humanity's shared story. That title isn't just a badge of honour, it's a promise. It means that the world has agreed Pompeii must be protected, studied, and passed down for future generations. Still, nothing can make Pompeii immortal. Every year, stones collapse, frescoes fade, and artefacts crumble. Preservation isn't about freezing time, it's about slowing its advance. Standing here, it's impossible not to think about fragility, of cities, of civilizations, of life itself. One moment, Pompeii was thriving. The next, it was ash. Vesuvius didn't discriminate between rich or poor, powerful or powerless. In its shadow, everyone was equally human, equally mortal. And yet, in that destruction, something survived. The details of their lives, their homes, their humour, their hopes. Pompeii became both a tragedy and a gift. For centuries, writers have imagined life here before the eruption. Edward Bulwer-Lytton's 1834 novel, The Last Days of Pompeii, painted the city in romance and drama. Filmmakers turned it into sweeping epics, from silent films in the 1910s to modern CGI recreations of the eruption. Documentaries, too, have brought Pompeii into living rooms around the world, using drone footage, reconstructions, and 3D models to make the ancient city walkable once again. Each generation reinterprets Pompeii as a warning about nature's power, a mirror of human society, or simply a fascinating place to explore. It continues to inspire art, music, and even fashion. Ancient fresco patterns reappearing on modern fabrics, or jewellery modelled after Pompeii designs. For archaeologists, Pompeii remains a living laboratory, a place where new technology constantly reveals more without destroying what's left. For visitors, it's a humbling reminder. All cities, no matter how mythical, how mighty, can vanish, and yet their stories can endure, if we choose to remember. Pompeii's legacy is this: you can't stop the mountain, but you can honour the people it took. In remembering them, we keep them alive. As you leave the city, you glance back one last time. The stones are quiet, but you know the streets are still full, not with people you can see, but with lives that echo through time.